Thank you, Hao Guang, for being here with us today.
Yeah.
My first question is, when did you decide to become a poet?
Okay, good question. So I had been writing for a long time, since I was a kid, since I was 7 years old, but I didn't really think I would be like a professional writer until maybe just a couple of years ago. So I had been writing a lot already, and I kind of accidentally fell into it. I didn't decide to be a professional writer, but I decided that I wanted to take my work more seriously and try to get it out there. And so I think that's how it started. Yeah.
What made you pick poetry as a specific genre of your literary expression?
Yeah, that's what I started writing. I have written some prose pieces over the years, but I still kind of, my first love is poetry. Yeah.
I read your book, The Deeds of Light, and I felt a lot of what you've touched upon are about places and about this sense of belonging. And also in your blog, I think you mentioned this book is about places, about the local, and about defamiliarizing the local. I was wondering, how do you situate yourself with this landscape and this place that you felt so attached to?
Yeah, I think you've got it right in that I am attached to this place, right? But at the same time, I don't necessarily feel a complete sense of belonging to it because I don't have like a long family history of being in Singapore. So that's where I'm coming from, both like a love-hate maybe, or like a familiar, weird kind of feeling towards it. So I would say that I can't really put it in words just like that, but through my poetry, I guess you get a sense of how I feel about it. Yeah.
What about China?
About China,
yes.
Yeah. So China is actually also very interesting. Well, my dad's from Hong Kong, so I've been to Hong Kong before, but this is my first time in Guone, right, in China proper, and I haven't really thought all that much about it because my forefathers were in China many generations ago, but since coming here, I think I've been forced to kind of confront and think about so many different ways of being Chinese. What is real and what is not real? Is there such a thing as not really Chinese? A quick story. I don't know if you have time, but a quick story was that in 2016, I was invited to the U.S. With writers from all around the world, and there was a writer from China, a writer from Shanghai actually, from Hong Kong, from Taiwan, and me, and we would all gather together and eat and talk. And I realized that at some point, it really became clear that I was considered the most, white Warren out of all the rest. Partially because I write in English, and partially because Singapore is definitely not part of China in a way that Taiwan and Hong Kong, depending on who you ask, you get different answers. But everyone agrees Singapore is not China, and that has been very interesting for me. Yeah.
How do you carry that identity, that distance into your writing of your poetry? Do you feel you always carry a strong Chinese identity or an identity into writing your poetry?
Yeah, not so much in Deeds of Light, but in my new work, I think the more I investigated, the ways of thinking about the Chinese language, the more it kind of pulled me into Chinese culture as well. And so a lot of my poems in the new stuff I'm doing do have references to Chinese, proverbs, Chinese history, Chinese culture. Yeah, and it's almost it wasn't intentional; it just happened. Yeah.
Speaking of your recent poetries, you translated a lot of Chinese poetry from Chinese poets.
Yeah.
You also wrote new poetry and poems, and I find there are a lot of deconstruction of forms and reconstruction of forms. I was wondering, how do you select your form or your style of writing while you are writing your poems?
Okay. So in general, the poems I'm writing now are playing with space, but I don't want to. So because it's play, I don't want to say, okay, it must happen this way, right? So I don't usually plan the form. I usually go by the train of thought that runs through the poem, and where it needs to turn, I try to allow it to turn freely. Yeah, and so there isn't really a fixed way that my poems could go. Yeah, it just so happens that now it tends to look kind of all spaced out. Yeah.
I was wondering when you're, from your own your own aesthetic of writing poems, who has mostly influenced you, or what kind of poems has really driven you to write poetry in one way or another?
Yeah. So the new work is very influenced by, in America, there's a school called the Black Mountain College in the 50s, the 30s to the 50s, it was open, and a lot of writing from there emphasized the idea of the page as a field of action, kind of like a canvas as a blank space where you can just play, right? And so the empty space in the poem would be as important as, or maybe more important than the words. So that's one strand. Another strand is a poet called Wang Mei, who I might have mentioned yesterday. She was actually born in China, born in Chongqing, and she grew up in Singapore, but she left for the US, and now she lives in Dublin. And her writing is also kind of borrows from that tradition a bit, from the Black Mountain tradition of playing with space. But she includes in her work a strong kind of bicultural sensibility, as she was raised by a mother who made her memorize classical poetry. So I'm inspired by her, and I think that's where my writing is most influenced by her ideas.
Aside from being a poet, I know you're also an editor, and also you write blogs. I was wondering how editing is different from writing poetry on your own.
Oh yeah, I think it's completely different. Sometimes I say that when I get sick of myself, I edit, so I can look at someone else's words, and then when I'm sick of dealing with other people, I come back to my own work. I think editing, there is a similarity though, I think, in both writing and editing. I think both practices try to encourage a certain kind of thinking to develop on its own terms. And so when I edit someone else's work, I don't want it to sound like me, right? I want it to be as them as possible. And same with my own work. I don't want my work to be too much of other people. I want it to be as me as possible. So there's a sense of respect for the work itself. But yeah, editing is difficult because you have to deal with other people. You have to email them, and if they have passed away, then you have to deal with their family members, and things get really complicated.
How do you find this entire process of interacting with people is different or similar with your interaction with words?
It's very different. Yeah, words are just there, right? You can move them around, but you can't control another person. So it's a lot more difficult, but also more rewarding. So I think a project I did on free verse, which is basically collecting poems from Singapore from the 1930s all the way to today. So I had to work with tens, dozens of writers. And although it was a difficult process, seeing it come together at the end was really very meaningful. Like we had a reading where people both old enough to be in a wheelchair and also young enough to be like a student, from the whole spectrum of Singapore society came to that reading. And to me that was a success. Like that was the reason why I edit, to bring people together.
I think that's a very rewarding social sort of message that is coming from editing that accompanies your own writing of your poems. On the other hand, I think there's also a lot of cultural capital involved in the editing process, and also we're always immune to those cultural capitals. I was wondering, how do you live with that cultural capital? How do you situate yourself both as a poet and as an editor within this world of like capitalism or?
Yes. Great question. So in Singapore, I think there's been a lot of thinking about what is a canon, right? What belongs in a body of work that everyone should read. And I think the general consensus is that canons are not necessary or less necessary than before. And at the same time, as this thought has happened, a lot of people are also doing anthologies. And so they just edit, every year a new thing comes out that someone has edited. And the problem, I think, with that is there's not much thought put into why these things belong together, right? So at least in editing, I'm less concerned about creating a must-read work and more concerned about what is the logic behind why the work in this book, fits together. So in the book, I actually say this book is not interested in forming a canon. In fact, it's more interested in breaking a canon. At least in Singapore, the tradition of writing in free verse is a lot stronger than formal verse. And so my book is formal verse. And so it's saying, okay, here is something that you haven't thought about before, about Singapore poetry. And let's present it in a book.
What about the cover of the poetry? Because the name of your book is Deeds of Light. And the entire design, I think, is very minimalistic, but also very interesting. I was wondering if there's a story behind it.
Yeah. Well, the story isn't really mine. It's not entirely mine. So we have, so many of us in the poetry community, we turned to a two-woman design company called Sarah & Schooling to design our covers. And they have been extremely supportive of the whole literary community. They do beautiful book covers. And I think what they do is that they actually read the whole work, and then they try to distill the work into a visual idea that both shows what the work is, but doesn't give everything away at the same time. Yeah. So I think for mine, probably what they did was, okay, Deeds of Light, and the idea of light, light rays kind of shining through the book. Yeah. So I really like their work. So I just trust them completely. I don't bother to make edits. I'll just send me what you have, and I'll say okay. Yeah.
I think this is a very wonderful combination of the visual art and the written language.
Yes.
And also yesterday you read your poems. I was wondering, how do you think these different medias where you can access the poetry or help people understand the poetry interact with each other? How do these different medias help people carve their experience of reading poetry?
So I think poetry is a very interesting medium or way of working with words, because it definitely has a strong visual element as well. Even if you don't think about like weird spacing, like typical poems tend not to go all the way to the edge, right? So they have a shape, right? They are broken into stanzas, so you can kind of see this is a bigger chunk, this is a smaller chunk. And already in that sense, poetry is visual. And I know that how Sarah & Schooling work is that when they lay out poetry, they tend to make certain decisions that they would not make in prose. I think they for example, they use a sans serif font, which is slightly less intuitive to read, so it makes you slow down, and because it makes you slow down, you focus on the words more. I think they centralize the poems instead of putting them to the side, so that your eye is always, in the middle of the page. So I mean, I'm not qualified to talk too much about these things, but I know for sure that behind the layout of a book is a lot of thought given to how to showcase the words the best they can be. Yeah.
I guess my last question for you is, what is your advice to young poets who are about to start out writing poetry?
Yeah, so I've thought about this many times because people have asked me, and I think the best answer I can give is to have fun. Right? If you enjoy writing, keep doing more of it. Right? If you don't enjoy it, then do something else that you enjoy.